What's going on, guys? Pete Nova here with the Face Off Sports Network. Appreciate everybody tuning in. It is about 8:50 in the morning over here on the East Coast. Wanted to go over some of the fantasy football cheat codes, in my opinion, some exploitable things that you can do in your drafts this year. Talk about some ADP. And overall, just talk some football. If guys have some questions, guys, gals, about their leagues that they might have drafts going on, maybe this week or this weekend specifically, I'd be happy to answer those questions for you as well. We did a Twitter Spaces yesterday, had a pretty good turnout, answered a ton of questions for people, and happy to answer questions for you guys. But I want to talk about mainly a couple of different data points that I like to look at when drafting, when targeting players. What I think are the most important stats and things to keep in mind when you are drafting in your fantasy leagues. I'm also going to talk about some ADPs that I think are just pretty exploitable. Also go over some draft strategy as well. So number one, talking about different types of draft strategies and what is most important. There's a lot of different things that are going to go out there in terms of this is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do if you want to win your leagues, and ultimately, I think people's strategies are going to be different depending on who you listen to, and overall, it varies from league to league. Some settings are different, but there are some stats specifically that are pretty important in my opinion. One of them would be targets per route run. Um, Pretty much it's the percentage of routes that a player is targeted on. And while it seems pretty basic, we all know volume is king when it comes to fantasy football, especially in PPR formats. You want to target guys that you think are going to, earn a lot of targets on the routes that they run. And the reason targets per route run is so important is, it pretty much isolates how often a player earns targets when they are actually in the route tree. So pretty much tells you more about the player's ability to demand the target volume than just raw targets alone. And so I think that's what's important, right? Targets are a little misleading in some type of way. It's important, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you that to completely ignore targets, but targets per route run gives you really more of an indication of, okay, when this guy's on the field, is this person or this player a key focal point in the offense, or is he demanding right targets? And that's why targets per run is more predictive than regular just targets in general, because year over year target volume it can be volatile, right? It can give you a good base, especially if guys have a historical floor of where they've been generating targets. But for me, targets per out run is pretty sticky across seasons. It correlates pretty well with target volume, and so I think it's one of the more important ones. An example would be a guy that maybe has 27% targets per route run but limited snaps. That could be a player that you should maybe target for maybe a breakout if you believe that their snap share could increase. I want to go and I'm going to share my screen here, but give you an example. But Josh Downs is one guy that comes to mind for me, right? When you think about Josh Downs, when it comes to target rate, targets per route run, last year was number 6, right? Or actually, he was number 5, and Josh Downs 29% of the time when he ran a route, he was targeted. And if we switch over to his profile and we just take a look, what Josh Downs, 107 targets last year, 72 receptions, 803 receiving yards. When you look at it, 13.1% fantasy points per game, ranked 28th, right? The biggest thing for Downs, though, is when he was on the field, like he was a very, very big focal point of their offense. You look at a lot of spike weeks that he had last year, 22, 15.9, 19.5. This is coming off of the ankle injury, 19.4, 14.2, 15.1, 19. I mean, he had, I don't want to add it up here live, but I'm pretty sure he had somewhere on 8 games where he was in the double digits for points, and probably over 5 or 6 games where he was 14 or more points. And so I think with Downs, though, if you look at, and I'm gonna pull up the total routes run for Downs, right? I would say he's probably not even in the top 40 or 50. And that's more so because for him, Josh Downs is not somebody who's out there on two wide receiver sets. And so that is one thing that kind of hinders him. Um, Let me take a look here. Routes run. All right. So I'm using Player Profiler here too, guys. If you are not using Player Profiler, you should be. But if we look at the routes run here, and this is just purely the top 25. I'm going to just punch in Downs' name here. Actually, I could probably find it on Downs' actual physical profile. I don't even need to do all that. So let me share his profile one more time here. Routes run 64, right? 64th in routes run, 362. It just goes to show, and you look at the route participation, that he's a guy that if you're predicting that he's going to run more routes this year, then he's a guy that you should target in fantasy, right? I mean, overall, wide receiver 35, it doesn't look sexy, but we talked about the spike weeks that he had. He also missed some time, and I like to look at points per game overall as more of an important stat than just total fantasy points. So Josh Downs is a good example of a guy that, if we're predicting that he might have a bigger role this year, Josh Downs is a great guy to target. We have the Anthony Richardson news where, now it's not Joe Flacco. Now it's Daniel Jones. And Daniel Jones, the one thing I would say about Jones over, a guy like Anthony Richardson is we can expect that he's going to work the intermediate more. Richardson's probably, going to be the guy that's slinging it downfield. And when you look at the average depth of target, right, Josh Downs 6.9, right? So he runs a lot in the intermediate when he is targeted. And so deep targets, right? I think Josh Downs can run and can fight for deep targets, but they have other players in that offensive system, that are more that fit that mold more to go downfield, like an Alec Pierce. I think he's a good guy. With Daniel Jones getting the nod here, I think Downs can be a very, very big benefactor here. And I think he's a guy that you should be looking at. And when I talked about the target rate, I do want to mention too that I made sure a guy had to run at least 200 targets. So that way we didn't get like really, really skewed stats there. But that's one of the more important stats that I like to look at here. What's up, Dynasty Gens? How you doing, man? And Big Draft Energy said volume is a lot. Yeah, volume is definitely a little bit misleading. But I mean, volume is still king. At the end of the day, guys that are getting volume are going to be guys that you can consistently start in a managed league. If you're playing a best ball league, volume might not matter nearly as much, because at the end of the day, you're looking for the big plays. And if a guy craps out on a week, well, you don't have to worry about him being in your starting lineup, because you might have guys that are going to be fillers, in those weeks that maybe your boom bust guy doesn't perform. And so that's why volume in a best ball format might not be nearly as important than volume in a managed redraft league, where, look, you need some floor. And I know people are very, very jacked up about upside. And that's really the common thing now with fantasy football, is a lot of people are looking for the biggest upside possible. In my redraft managed leagues, you need some floor. I truly, truly believe that you need to mix in some floor picks in with some high upside picks. The odds of you winning, in my opinion, are low, because there's going to be a lot of weeks where, yeah, your team might be extremely explosive and have the highest chance to score a ton of points on any given week. But if those guys aren't scoring, and their floors are really low and they're not scoring a lot of points at the same time on the same weeks, you're probably not going to make the playoffs, because you need to win and you need a winning record. And so while that might sound pretty dumbed down, I think that's what's important is, we have to keep that in mind when it comes to floor and upside, and we want to chase that upside, but it's just something that we need to keep in mind, when we are drafting, in my opinion. So let's shift over here to another stat that I find to be important as well. It's first read target share, right? And you can go to Fantasy Points. They have they have this metric there. I don't know if Player Profiler has the first read target share. I will take a look and see. But fantasy points, they have it, and pretty much first read target share. It's pretty obvious what it is. Percentage of team pass plays where the player is the quarterback's first read, right? If the player is the quarterback's first read, right, it's going to signal that there is trust in the offense, right? That's a safety blanket, right? And why it matters is the first read targets typically are the most reliable targets in an offense, right? They often come quick, they come in rhythm, they come in by design, right? So they're designed targets usually, and these are the sign. These are kind of a sign of trust that a player is a game plan focus, right? And so that's important. Why it's predictive is because a high first read share equals consistent usage, right? If you look at the data from last year, there haven't been major changes to an offense like offense coordinator, quarterback changes, maybe a big addition in terms of like another weapon in the offense, right? If it's fairly a similar offense, right, you can predict that probably going to be a similar year over year. Take a team like the Arizona Cardinals, right? And I don't have their first read share in front of me, but if it's Trey McBride or it's Marvin Harrison Jr., believe it's probably very, very. It's probably not Trey McBride, but Trey McBride was the highest targeted player there. But overall, or not targeted, but just in general, he was probably the biggest safety net there. But that offense didn't change, right? I mean, they really didn't bring any big pieces on the offense side of the football at all. Quarterback stays the same. OC stays the same. I mean, maybe there's slight changes in how they want to play and how they want to do things in the scheme, but overall, it's probably going to stay similar. And it helps distinguish with first read target share between wide receivers getting lucky targets versus wide receivers having defined roles in an offense. And so that's why it's pretty important and predictive. And another example, and I have this written down here, but a wide receiver that has 27% total target share is awesome, but a wide receiver that has a 30% first read share is more dependable, right? And so, that's important. That's one that I like to take a look at here. I don't necessarily think that Player Profiler has that specifically in their stats. I want to take a look and see. Let's see. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think they do. But that's okay. I use Fantasy Points Data Suite for that. I used it before I started using Player Profiler Suite. I do predominantly use Player Profiler though when it comes to all of my data that I am doing. And if you're following Player Profiler, I will be doing top 10 takeaways on Mondays live at 6 p.m. this year over there at Player Profiler. It's not going to prohibit me from doing my work here on Mondays as well. We're going to be doing, reaction shows. Hoff is going to be hosting that here, but it'll be cool. I'm going to have a lot of data that I can provide that maybe on the surface guys are not going to know about or guys aren't going to see. And it's not just looking at a box score. And while data is not the end all be all, data can tell a decent story, and we can kind of connect the dots and fill in the blanks after that. So I think all that is good stuff. And so that's what I'm going to be doing, with Player Profiler this year, and I'm excited for it. And so I appreciate everybody that supported me, doing what I love here. And if you are here early in the morning, make sure you hit that thumbs up, subscribe, give us a like, send your comments, questions. If you have any questions here, if you are drafting this weekend, I'd be happy to help you out. And I know yesterday we did a spaces, and I've already gone over two of my favorite strategies. I know we have some new people here trickling in, but I went over two of my favorite strategies so far when it comes to just data and metrics to look at when it comes to, predicting a breakout for a wide receiver, or overall, just dependability in an offense. We're going to talk about some exploitable ADPs a little bit later on in the show here. But I just wanted to get some of this good information out to you guys and kind of just go from there. And again, if anybody has questions, that they want to share, about maybe their drafts or anything like that, feel free to let me know. I'll happily take some time out of the show to answer you. But appreciate everybody being here today. And the next one here is going to be Yards per route run. And you hear this a lot in the fantasy community. This might be one of, if not the most important metrics, in my opinion, when it comes to just predicting fantasy success, right? Yards per route run is pretty much just total receiving yards divided by total routes. And why it matters is because it combines, efficiency yards with opportunity and routes. And so more predictive than yards per catch and or yards per target rate. And why it's predictive is because yards per route run is been found to kind of correlate with future performance, and it's widely used in NFL analytics. An example would be a wide receiver with a 2.5 yards per route run. Often are elite. Some with a 1.0 or lower is likely just a role player. And so when we look at last season, and I'm going to share my screen here. But when we look at last season and we check out a lot of the players, these are if we sort this by 300 snaps minimum here, and we look at the players at the wide receiver position that were leaders in that yards per route run, you get Puka Nakua, you get AJ Brown, you get Nico Collins, right? Those three guys, Puka Nakua, when it comes to fantasy points per game, I'm just taking a look, but I'm pretty sure, yeah, Puka Nakua, 18.8 points per game, number 2 in the NFL last year. AJ Brown, while he had some injuries, just like Puka, was phenomenal last year when he was on the field, right? He was 16.7, number 12 in points per game. And then you also look at Nico Collins, right? And Nico Collins was also phenomenal when healthy. Ironically, these three guys had issues staying healthy, but Nico Collins, 17.6 points per game. That's number 8 in the NFL. Yards per route run could possibly be the most important stat to take a look at. And you hear it a lot by fantasy analysts, and it's extremely important when predicting and going over and looking year over year. We can even keep going down the list here. Adam Thielen, I don't know why. Well, it's probably ranked somebody's sandwich in the middle here because they probably didn't meet that 300 threshold there. But when we look at, let's just take a look at Adam Thielen, because I'm not sure how high Adam Thielen finished last year in terms of points per game. 27, right? So 14th. But again, Adam Thielen was practically a free pick last year. And Adam Thielen had some pretty strong spike weeks for you last year. If you looked at him down the stretch, week 17, he had 28 points. Week 16, he had 15. Week 15, he had 10. Week 14, he had 19. Week 13, he had 29. He started off slow, old man Adam Thielen. But when he came back, very, very likely he was in your starting lineup once he gave you a 23 and a 19-point game, played Dallas, right? There's a very, very solid chance that you started Adam Thielen for your playoffs, even in the flex. There was a lot of injuries down the stretch last year. And Adam Thielen, while week 15 maybe was the lowest, he still gave you a nice game out of a flex with 10 points if the rest of your lineup performed. But then you're looking at 15 and 28. So again, the yards per route run is a very, very strong indicator. You get Justin Jefferson, you get Lad McConkey, you get Brian Thomas Jr. Those are the next guys, and we know how well those guys performed last year. So again, yards per route run is probably the most widely known, and probably the one that most fantasy analysts tout as the most important when it comes to predicting fantasy success. And a lot of times that's what we use when it comes to looking at players coming out of college, right? And trying to predict those. And that's never a perfect game, but that's a lot of times what is looked at when people are evaluating things. I got Albert in the house, I got Hoff in the house. I got my guy Steve. He said Thielen was a great value in DFS last year. Absolutely. Michael Hoff, who is in the chat here, could tell you the same, right? And that is one thing that Hoff is really good at. Hoff is doing he's doing his investment article for Sharp Analysis this year, and we're excited that he's going to bring that here as well. He's going to do some DFS shows, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And I'm not really, for me, DFS. I wish I could get into DFS more because I think I could make some really good money. But I just find myself so stretched around in terms of, Rooting for fantasy, doing some daily lineups in even like when it comes to like underdog. And I do want to get into DFS more this year. I don't know if I'm going to be sports betting as much because I want to either go sports betting or I want to do DFS. I keep saying this every year. Well, I'm gonna more focus on DFS, and then I don't end up doing it, and it's kind of a bummer. But I think this year is going to be the year that I'm going to do it. But let's move on to the next indicator here, and that would be pass rate over expected, especially in PPR leagues. Pass rate over expected pretty much is how often a team passes compared to the expected rate in each game situation. So down, distance, and scoring, right? Why it matters is it tells you if a team wants to pass, right? If a team has a high pass rate over expected, that means that there are more passing opportunities for wide receivers, tight ends, and running backs, and can likely sustain more fantasy assets in an offense, right? And so that's important. When we talk about the wide receiver two on an offense, the Jordan Addisons, the T. Higgins, right? The Travis Hunters, right? All of these wide receiver twos in offenses, right? Playing with a team that has a high pass rate over expected, again, likely can sustain more fantasy assets in an offense. An example would be, even if a team's total passing attempts were average last year, a high passing rate over expected might indicate that passing is their default, which would be good for stacking, right? So it would indicate that, hey, while maybe their league average in terms of total passing attempts, the offense might not have been that great, and so maybe they just had less offensive plays overall. But in general, they're passing over expected, right? And so that means in situations they tend to want to throw the football more than they want to run the football. Even if the analytics say they should run, they like to pass more than the typical team in those down and distance situations. I want to take a look because I think this is a good one to talk about here. And I'm going to share my screen and I'm using the NFELO app, which I find pretty good for some of this kind of maybe not necessarily fantasy stats, but more just these more team stats. And if you look at pass rate over expected last year, the Cincinnati Bengals, right, number one in the NFL, right, and if you go to their pass rate. Bengals were actually not number one in pass rate last year. It was actually the Browns, but they ended up being number one in pass rate over expected. You look at the Chiefs, right? Chiefs, 64% in terms of pass rate, 5.2% in terms of pass rate over expected. Now, that is interesting because when we look at the Chiefs last year, I wouldn't necessarily say that the Chiefs had, a ton of high valued fantasy assets in that offense. I mean, ultimately, Rashi Rice was injured for majority of the year. Kelsey was actually not as bad as people think last year at the tight end position. He was still a top, I think, 6 tight end in total fantasy points and fantasy points per game, somewhere around there. You can fact check me in the comments on that. But this is obviously not a perfect stat, but when you even look at the Vikings, right? Pretty surprising that the Vikings pass as much as they did, right? If we go to pass rate, they actually were kind of middle of the field here at 61%. But pass rate over expected shows you that Kevin O'Connell likes to throw the football in down and distances where many teams or the analytics are telling you they should probably run the ball. And so I think that's going to be interesting. I think that comes down a little bit this year with JJ McCarthy. They brought in Jordan Mason. And so I don't expect them to be, this high in terms of pass rate over expected this year. Same with the Jets, right? Jets bring in Justin Fields. I do not expect them to be this high in pass rate over expected. Heck, same with the Seattle Seahawks, right? Like these are teams that I think are going to buck the trends from last year. I think they're gonna be probably maybe not completely flipped, but like Seattle's going to run the ball a lot this year. I think that's why they fired Ryan Grubb. I think a lot of people, including myself, were expecting them to throw the football a ton last year, but with Ryan Grubb coming out of Washington with his passing attack, and that's what they did, but they just were not very effective, and that running game was pretty bad. Texans are interesting, guys. Texans are pretty interesting because, you get the Texans here at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You get the Texans here at 6 in terms of pass rate over expected. And while it's not a very, very high number, it's only 0.8%. It is a little interesting because that offensive running game could be pretty bad this year. And that offensive line was bad last year. I think it's going to be bad this year, but they did add a lot of weapons to that passing attack. And a lot of people are sitting here saying that the Texans are going to be a team that is going to throw the football a ton this year because of how bad that offensive line is going to be in that rushing. Well, because of how bad that running game is going to be. Um, but the next thing I want to talk about is going to be expected fantasy points, right? And expected fantasy points is pretty much a model based stat that pretty much calculates how many fantasy points a player should have scored based on their volume and usage. So it takes account down and distance, red zone, target depth. Why it matters is because it separates volume from efficiency. If a player is underperforming in their expected fantasy points, it might be bad luck or poor efficiency, right? If they're outperforming their expected fantasy points, you can probably expect that there's a regression coming. And so why it's predictive is because volume is more predicted than efficiency. And so, expected fantasy points lets you kind of spot breakout candidates and also regression risks, right? A running back getting 18 expected fantasy points per game, but only scoring 11 points per game could be a good buy low candidate. You look at the Denver Broncos are a great example here. The Denver Broncos, the running back position was in the top 10 for expected fantasy points, but the Denver Broncos were in the bottom of the league in terms of total fantasy points for the running back. So you plug in some better players this year, and you can likely expect that that's not going to stay the same from what we saw last year. So the Broncos are a good example as why expected fantasy points, are important. Now, the last one that I'm going to talk about today is going to be opportunity share, and then we're going to get to some values at ADPs that I'm targeting right now. Opportunity share, what exactly is it? Right, it's pretty much the percentage of team running back carries and targets a player gets. Right, and so why it matters is because it shows how much of the backfield a player physically controls. Obviously more share equals more chances to score fantasy points, right? Why it's predictive is because it tends to be a more stable stat that helps spot true lead backs as well as breakout candidates, right? If a running back jumps from 30% to a 70% opportunity share, they're obviously probably the starter, right? And that's not mind blowing information to share. But the reason I say 30% and 70% is because that guy that's getting a 70% opportunity share, if that guy goes down, most teams they want to still stick with that one back if that's what they're typically used to doing. You take a guy like Jonathan Taylor, for example. Jonathan Taylor, was, I believe, in the top 3, and I don't have him in front of me, but Jonathan Taylor was in like the top 3 for opportunity share last year. And so I think when you look at a guy like him, DJ Giddens is a good example of a guy that maybe you're handcuffing because DJ Giddens will step into a very, very big workload if Jonathan Taylor goes down. So the last thing we want to talk about today is just some overall just ADP and some players to exploit here at ADP. I'm going to pull up Fantasy Pros so you guys can physically see what I'm looking at here from in terms of just a cost standpoint. I may have to move myself though so you can see the screen a little bit better. So just bear with me here. All right, so that should be good. Shoot, hold on, guys. Oh, well, that didn't work. Let's see. All right, there we go. Okay. So let's take a look at some of the overall ADPs here. Now, I would say that to me personally, I think that ESPN's probably has the most exploitable or one of the more exploitable is probably the most exploitable site to use when it comes to fantasy points and where their ADPs are. So if we look at like ESPN, for example, and you look at a lot of these outliers here, right? Drake London, for example, Drake London right here, number 21. Compared to other sites, even CBS has him at 25. Sleeper has Drake London at 17. Right, Drake London going majority of sleeper leagues at that 1-2 turn, somewhere around that like that 203, 204 spot. In ESPN leagues, I mean, you're practically getting Drake London towards the back half of the second round. Extremely, extremely exploitable if you are drafting on ESPN. So that's a guy to take a look at. You also look at ESPN here. Jonathan Taylor going at the 1-2 turn here. On sleeper, Taylor is practically back half of the second round. I think that's more where his value should be. I think he should probably be more of an early third round pick. I'm not touching JT in that second round unless there's a heavy running back run and there's not a lot of depth left and I need to take him because he's the last guy in my tier. But Jonathan Taylor to me should not be Jonathan Taylor should not be a top of the second round pick. But ESPN, it's to me, I think it's a lot more old school players, right? And boomer draft strategy maybe is the best way to put it. And I think ESPN has a lot of guys that are used to just drafting running backs, right? Like that's just typically what you see. Like they value that running back position much more. But even looking down here at some of the other ADPs that I think could be a little bit more exploitable, let's scroll down to the bottom. And there's a guy that I have in mind here, and it's Chris Olave, and I don't have his off the top of my head, but ESPN has Chris Olave here at 87. Sleeper has him at 75. CBS has him at 93. There's no world where Chris Olave should barely be a top 100 pick on CBS. It's just not, it just shouldn't happen in PBR. There's just no reason. I get it. The concussions are a concern for Chris Olave, guys, but Chris Olave was a second round pick last year. And I get it. The quarterback situation is a little scary. So it's not just the concussions for Olave, but you're talking about a guy who's going to be in that power slot role for Kellen Moore. We've seen what these wide receivers that play in the slot can do in Kellen Moore's offenses. And I think Chris Olave is going to be really, really good this year. Touchdowns are really the biggest concern here, but at his current cost, I mean, you're maybe expecting him not to score a lot of touchdowns. And so, with that in mind, ultimately, you're getting his touchdown issues, his concussion issues, his quarterback issues. You're getting that baked in. Sleeper has him at 75. I see a guy like Ricky Pearsall, who, if you follow the show, you know that I've been extremely high on Ricky Pearsall, extremely, extremely high on Ricky Pearsall. Somehow, Ricky Pearsall, CBS has been sharper on him, and he's moved up in terms of their ADP. Real time ADP has him at 84, so up 8 spots. No world where Ricky Pearsall should be this low. I have Ricky Pearsall as a top 30 wide receiver. I believe I have him at wide receiver 26. I expect really, really big things for Ricky Pearsall. Ricky Pearsall is a guy that if there was a player that I do not want to leave a draft without, it's Ricky Pearsall this year. That's how confident I feel in him. I understand that, their injuries are a little bit of a concern with just the 49ers in general, but you have the two other wide receivers in Juwan Jennings, who is it a holdout or is it an actual injury? You have Brandon Ayuk, who I don't expect to be back until really week 6. And even when he comes back, like how much ramp up time is he going to need? And then again, Juwan Jennings, who had an outlier year, right? Like he was a favorite target for Brock Purdy, but he's not out there right now. And we saw how Ricky Pearsall looked in the preseason. I didn't need to see that preseason game for Ricky Pearsall to say, yeah, like I'm bumping him up the rankings, right? Like that's not necessarily why I have Ricky Pearsall as high as I do. But what I actually want to do is I want to pull up my rankings, and I want to compare, how different my rankings are to a lot of the ADPs and why I think some of them are exploitable. So when we let's just go to the wide receiver position. And I think there's a lot of value at wide receiver this year. Let's take Tet McMillan, for example. And I've talked about Tet McMillan a ton this year. He does have a hamstring injury, so there's a possibility I bump him down in my rankings just a little bit, just because I don't know how long it's going to take him to come back to form. But Tet McMillan, wide receiver 28 on Sleeper, wide receiver 33 on ESPN. I'm targeting Tet McMillan heavily in my drafts. Tet McMillan, the difference that I have here in my rankings compared to Tet, I have Tet McMillan as my wide receiver 17. And if you do want all the rankings, guys, we do have it in our Discord. I'll share that Patreon link, but we have free rankings, and then if you want to pay, for the more in depth with tiers and all that good stuff, we also have, you can go there at the link and you can pay for that as well. But even if you want to just do the free tier, right? The free tier allows you, to chat with us, right? Ask us questions. We help people with their drafts as they are drafting. They send questions in. I did send over the link. So even if you don't want to pay for the paid tier, you can jump in the free tier, hop in the Discord, and it's the easiest way that you'll be able to get in contact with us if you have questions, like maybe a trade comes in and you're itching to, figure out, like, should I take this deal or not, and you're afraid that it's gonna, it's gonna get withdrawn or pulled. You can have contact with us where we'll answer you as quickly as possible, and it just gives you some more access to us. But again, Ted McMillan, wide receiver 28. I have him at wide receiver 17. I think that's a really, really good value getting Ted McMillan here at 60. I mean, 60, you're talking about, fifth round for Tet. I think that's a perfectly fine value. I like to generally, if I'm taking three running backs in the first 5 picks, which is what I like to do, I get a stud wide receiver maybe. So I think my strategy this year is to try to get a stud wide receiver round 1, and then I'm trying to hit running back in rounds 2 and 3, and then probably hit maybe wide receiver in rounds 4 or 5 with another running back, right? And so that's like, if you can get a stud wide receiver and Tet's your wide receiver 2, I think there is some top 15 upside, and some spike weeks possible for Tet. I really do believe that, and you're getting him at a really, really good cost, in my opinion. Guys that I'm a little bit lower on than consensus, Jameson Williams is one of them. I have Jameson Williams at my wide receiver 33. He's on the board here, at least on average, at wide receiver 27. Sleeper has him at 29. I'm not as super high on JMO. I think the problem that I have with JMO is it's the big plays. I don't think that volume ticks up. We did do a breakdown on Jameson Williams the other day, and I have some concerns about Jameson Williams and just overall, where he goes in drafts. I'm not taking him over Calvin Ridley. I'm not taking him over Chet McMillan. I'm not taking him over George Pickens. I could be sold on him over Travis Hunter. I think both of them have question marks in some sort of way, but JMO is also in the better offense, so I could understand somebody, going with JMO over Travis Hunter, but I have Travis Hunter as my wide receiver 28. So I'd be taking Hunter. I have Xavier Worthy, I have Zay Flowers, I have Devonta Smith. I have all those guys ahead of Jameson Williams. So that's kind of where I'm looking at. But a lot of the value, guys, is at the wide receiver position. That's why this year I really, really like to hit the running backs early and often in my drafts. And then after that, I'm trying to target a lot of these receivers. Maybe it's a dead zone. I don't know. But a lot of these guys look really, really good. And the opportunity is certainly there for plenty of these guys in that rounds 5 to 7 to even 8 range. It's just a ton of value. And then that's when, really towards that, like, pick 80 to, 120 is when I start taking the tight ends and the quarterbacks, because, like, ultimately I think there's tons of value there too. So I'm trying to pick my spots with value this year. Stephon Diggs is another guy, guys, right now, wide receiver 37, pick 81 off the board. He's wide receiver 40 on Sleeper. I don't think I'm super, super different there. I have him at wide receiver 38. So it's not really a big difference in terms of that. Garrett Wilson, I did drop down in my rankings recently a little bit. I have Garrett Wilson behind T. Higgins, JSN, and Lad McConkey now. I do have some concerns where I think the volume will be there, but the quality, what is the quality of that volume going to be for Garrett Wilson? So that's some concerns there. Let's see who else. Let's slide over to the running back position. One guy that, I mean, if you're looking at my Twitter account, you're pretty familiar with how I feel about this guy. Zach Charbonnet. Right now, he goes off the board as the RB 38. On Sleeper, he's 38. On ESPN, he's 42. Going off the board at pick 114. This is a guy I'm absolutely loving taking in drafts this year. You have the injury concerns with Kenneth Walker right now. I have Zach Charbonnet right behind Caleb Johnson at my RB30. I have behind ahead of Brian Robinson. I have him ahead of Travis Etienne, Joe Mixon, Jordan Mason, Tyrone Tracy, Ramondre Stevenson, Jalen Warren. I love Zach Charbonnet this year, and I did drop some information on him. Yes, well, this past week I've dropped a lot of information, but here's the thing with Zach Charbonnet. When you look at this running back room, Zach Charbonnet was phenomenal last year, right? And I say that, and people might sit here and say phenomenal. Maybe that's a little bit of a stretch. Zach Charbonnet last year, number 2 in routes run. This guy was heavily involved in the offense from a passing game standpoint. And this is also, they're getting an offensive coordinator in Clint Kubiak who likes to throw to the running back position. And so number 2 in routes run, number 15 in total targets at the running back position, number 11 in fantasy points per opportunity, number 11. So that means like when he got the football, right? Like he was producing fantasy points at an elite efficient rate per the opportunities he was getting. Number 14 in receptions, number 10 in yards after contact per attempt, right? You're talking about an OC upgrade, a scheme upgrade, right? And the O-line is getting better. They added Gray Zabel. They had their freaking, I believe it was their center or guard retired like mid-season last year, right? So that O-line can't be much worse. And so Kenneth Walker has the injury concerns. He did practice this week. He was practicing in the joint practices, which is a positive. But a lot of signs and a lot of smoke out of Seattle have been that Zach Charbonnet has been really good this year. Really good this camp. And so I think he's a really good value. He's my favorite handcuff to draft, and I don't even know if I view him as like that much of it. I think he has standalone value. I really believe that. So I'm very high on Zach Charbonnet. Tony Pollard's another guy that I think is a little bit undervalued here. I would have thought that with the Tajay Spears injury, that Tony Pollard would have maybe raised a little bit more than he has. He's my RB23 right now. He goes off the board as RB26. He's actually off the board at RB28 on Sleeper. I mean, look, Tajay Spears is a guy that has now the high ankle sprain. Um, High ankle sprains are tough at the running back position. When you also factor in that the style of Tajay Spears, the way he cuts and the way he's shifty and all of that and moves laterally, he's not a north and south runner, right? And so that lateral movement, right, is really tough with the high ankle sprain, right? It would be different if it was a guy that just runs straight forward, and that's kind of where where they where he makes his hay. But I mean, I think Tony Pollard is a really good value this year. He didn't miss really much time at all the last 2 seasons. Tajay Spears is a guy that's consistently been injured. So Tony Pollard is a guy that I have my eyes on as well. I really like where he's going. Pacheco's a little concerning for me. I don't have him as high. I mean, 22 on Sleeper. I have Pacheco at 25 behind Aaron Jones, behind Montgomery. There are talks that they need to add a running back to that room. Elijah Mitchell sounds like he doesn't have the juice like it was initially reported. Carson Steele, great story, fun story last year. One of my waiver darlings last year. But at the end of the day, it looks like they're trying to add to this room, even if Pacheco is healthy. And I think ultimately with Pacheco, I think they're concerned about the injury risk, right? And he runs really hard and plays really hard. And so is there a world where Pacheco ends up being in more of a split backfield? And if Pacheco's in a split backfield, with the low receiving volume that he gets. I know he had a pretty good year 2 years ago when it came to catching the football, but I think that's more of an outlier. I don't think that's what they want to do. They brought in Brashard Smith. I think he's going to catch passes. And ultimately, if Pacheco loses out doesn't get a ton of volume, he's going to have to be like extremely efficient this year. And so I think that there's a world where Kansas City's going to bring a guy in, and if you sat here and told me that they brought in Brian Robinson, um, I think Pacheco is the more explosive back. Um, but ultimately, I wouldn't say it would be like a significant downgrade from Pacheco to B Rob. So I think that's kind of where I'm at. Patrick said would love to, and said would love to join the Discord. Can't seem to find it on the Patreon. Yeah, let me send the Discord link in here, so that you have it. Just give me 1 second. Yeah, and like I said, you can be a free member in the Discord, if you want access to some of the other benefits. You can be a paid premium member as well. I'm trying to find the link here, so just hang with me 1 second. Here we go. All right. So I'll send the Discord link in here. But I've been recently dropping some film clips too. So if people are interested, like I've been dropping some film analysis. We have a whole section in there called the film room, which I think is pretty cool. I'll share that for a second. If you look at our Discord here, I pretty much clip up a bunch of plays. I go through some of my thoughts on the plays. I even kind of share maybe for some that maybe are not super keen on the X's and O's. I kind of explain it here, like talking about the Packers running, a double mug 4 quarters look with a simulated pressure, right? Kind of breaking down some film. So that's a cool little thing that you can have. And that's not even for paid premium members. That's for free. So you don't have to be a paid member to get access to that. So that's a pretty cool little feature that we have in the Discord. I just sent it over there, Patrick, if you want to take a look. I do want to talk about Quinshon Judkins, and I need to adjust my rankings a little bit, and I think move him down. The fact that there are reports that the Browns are in the market looking for a running back when they drafted Dylan Sampson, they have Jerome Ford still on the roster, and now Quinshon Judkins gets the charges dropped. The fact that this team is reportedly looking at the running back position to possibly add there, I have a little bit of concern. Judkins, it's second now. We're not too far away from the season, and I had bumped Judkins up to my RB 26 when the news dropped that the charges were being dropped, but he hasn't practiced still, and he hasn't signed that contract. And so, that's giving me a little bit of pause and a little bit of concern there, especially if you don't have the ability to put a guy on IR. He's not suspended right now, so I don't really know where how Sleeper would designate him, like maybe just out. I don't know, but that might not be a guy that you're able to put on your IR. And so I have to move Judkins probably down my rankings. Right now he's about RB 28. I would absolutely take Zach Charbonnet over Quinshon Judkins, I think, at this point. Just given everything that's going on. I would take Caleb Johnson, I think, take Cam Scatterbo, I take Swift. I think I'd probably slot him in probably around RB 30, 31, and maybe bump Charbonnet up to 29, and have him kind of where B Rob is in my rankings. I think that's probably fair and what I'd be looking at. Because Judkins, this whole stuff, I don't really know what's happening over there. But that's just a little bit of insight that I have, guys. I am going to be updating my rankings. If you are a Patreon member and you are listening, I am updating my rankings, my top 300. I'll have an update today to get people ready to go for their drafts this weekend, and excited to bring all that information to you guys. We're going to continue to help you guys out through draft season here. We have a couple more weeks, but this is pretty much an exciting week for a lot of people, weekend, because this is when a lot of drafts start to kick off and start to roll. So excited to bring you more content. Excited to be here with you guys in the season. Stick around. It's going to be a lot of fun, and I'll see you guys next time.